Hello and welcome to No5 Chambers' inaugural podcast to our conferences and seminars on all matters planning and environment. I'm Hashi Mohammed, a barrister at No5 and your host for this hopefully informative podcast. But first, something which used to dominate our lives so much, but we might have completely forgotten. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Paul Cairns, QC, and Tim Jones. Now, Paul, do you remember that word Brexit? Is it still happening?
Hello, Hashi. Nice to hear from you. And yes, that thing called Brexit is underway. And the paper that Tim and I have prepared is addressing the questions that most practitioners would like to hear as best we can in this time of uncertainty.
And does at the moment of course, we are in a moment of uncertainty, but it might be worth just reminding our listeners and our delegates who will have heard from you at the ICC, does EU law still actually apply to England and Wales at the moment, even though we have ostensibly left?
Yes, it does. We are in a period during which the existing EU laws, regulations, legislation, both secondary and primary, do apply, along with rulings of the Court of Justice. But there are changes which we discuss, and there are further inevitable changes which we anticipate and address in our paper.
And Tim, in the past, as we know, it was the EU Commission who used to enforce EU law. And now in this period of transition that Paul is talking about, who will be this enforcer in the future?
In the future, that is from the beginning of next year, there will be an Office of Environmental Protection. That's being brought in by the Environment Bill 2020. And that will be a board, in effect, appointed by the Secretary of State.
And are you able to say in terms of what that looks like, and in terms of, for example, if you were to apply for judicial review, how that would work in that environment bill?
Well, what would happen would be you would if you wish to, make a complaint to the OEP. And if they believe that a public authority had failed to comply with environmental law, they would give a decision notice. Obviously, the intention is that the public authority then complies with that decision notice. But in the event of non-compliance, the OEP can apply for judicial review with somewhat fewer restraints than would be the case for another applicant.
Now, Paul, just taking one step back in terms of the substantive EU law, we know that the law on environmental impact assessments or SEAs or the habitats regulations will remain the same until we're told otherwise. But what happens with any new EU laws that are made after the 31st of January?
Well, in terms of new laws, we're still being bound by EU laws until such time as we have our own system in place. Tim was talking about the OEP that is proposed. But of course, the finer details of that and of course its remit have yet to be determined during this 12-month implementation period. So what we cover there are the various scopes, if I may say that, put it in those terms, as to what is going to be just temporary and what is going to be taken over by the new OEP. A matter of importance, Hashi, is that the final shape of our Office for Environmental Protection has yet to be determined, because of course we also need to factor in devolved powers, because the Brexit was EU-wide, but many of the powers that had previously been within the remit of the EU will fall under the devolved powers. As Tim has just touched upon, our paper references the Environment Bill of 2020. And of course, we have to also look at its accompanying policy statement and construe it partly in the context of the withdrawal agreement of 2019, the political declaration, because When we left the EU, part of the powers in terms of environmental matters will not go just to will go to the UK governments. In other words, we also have to work out and also identify those areas of environmental protection that will now fall within devolved powers.
And Tim, in terms of then how this sort of OEP, this Office of Environmental Protection, is actually going to work, what are the concerns? I mean, about the practicalities of how it will operate?
The main concern that has been raised is whether it will cause delay. You have, first of all, a complaint to the OEP. You then have the OEP investigating the complaint. You then have a decision notice. You may then have a judicial review. All being well, that will be dealt with swiftly and promptly. But clearly there is a potential for delay and the uncertainty that goes with the delay.
Thank you very much to Paul Cairns, Queen's Counsel, and Tim Jones. Gentlemen, thank you very much for that update on something that was dominating all of our lives before the current crisis. And so we shall see how that also plays out. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the Number 5 Chambers podcast, giving you the latest updates on all matters planning and environment.